Hey guys, today I'll show you a horror thriller TV series named Forever Part 2. Spoilers ahead, watch out and take care. The drama begins with an old man who was feeding pigeons in the park when suddenly he suffered a heart attack and passed away. There were no suspicious signs on the body or at the scene. Everyone assumed the elderly man had died of natural causes, and as the staff were about to move the body, a scar on his abdomen caught Henry's attention. Lucas thought it was from an appendectomy, but the scar was unusually irregular. Henry suddenly recalled a past incident. The scar's appearance wasn't due to the surgeon's skill, but rather the lack of a proper medical environment, and it turned out that the doctor had been Henry himself. Back in 1955, Henry and his second wife were traveling by train, while Abe had been sent to stay with her parents. It was supposed to be their honeymoon. Just as they were about to start a family, a sudden knock on the door interrupted them. A military officer explained that they urgently needed a doctor. When Henry arrived at the compartment, he found a young boy in severe pain. After diagnosing acute appendicitis, it was clear that immediate surgery was necessary. During the procedure, Henry learned that the boy was of noble birth, none other than the son of a king. In those extreme conditions, Henry performed the surgery on the moving train, and the resulting scar was uneven due to the train's constant jolting. Henry recognized the old man as the boy from years ago and decided to take the body back to the morgue. Just then, an elderly woman hurried over, claiming that the deceased was her husband, their king. Upon further investigation, Joe discovered that the country had long been in turmoil, with the previous king having met a tragic end. This old man had narrowly escaped, living incognito ever since. The sheriff instructed Joe to contact the embassy to arrange for the old man's body to be returned quietly, avoiding any potential international incidents. But Henry secretly met with the dead man's wife. It turned out he was there to return a ring, a token given to him by the king as a gesture of gratitude for saving the boy. Unable to reveal the truth, Henry simply claimed to have bought the ring from an antique shop. The elderly woman warmly welcomed Henry, perhaps sensing a half-century-old connection. Henry abruptly asked her if her husband had a good life. She replied that he had only one regret, wanting to return to his homeland before he died. However, Henry noticed signs of radiation therapy on the old man's body, making long-distance travel impossible. The woman was puzzled, stating that her husband had always refused chemotherapy, so how could he have radiation exposure? Suddenly, a thought struck Henry, and he rushed back to the morgue, only to find the body gone. As the corpse was being wheeled into an elevator, Henry quickly instructed Lucas to stop it, then squeezed inside himself. Henry pulled out a detector and began scanning the body. Lucas asked what he was doing, and Henry explained that the deceased had been poisoned with a radioactive substance, meaning anyone who came into close contact with the body was exposed to radiation. This revelation terrified the royal bodyguards, who scattered in a panic. Joe happened to witness the scene and overheard Lucas's explanation. It was indeed a murder case. Henry clarified that since the victim was a king, it was considered an assassination, not just a murder. Lucas found traces of radioactive material, curry stew, and yak meat in the king's stomach. Using these clues, Henry and Joe quickly traced their investigation to a restaurant. The owner was uncooperative, and it turned out he was from the same homeland as the king, having later immigrated here. As a child, he had suffered under the monarchy, bearing scars from a long-lost form of torture. He was lucky to have survived at such a young age. When the owner passed by Henry, the detector suddenly beeped. It turned out Henry had forgotten to turn it off. Further testing revealed that the radiation was coming from a bowl in the owner's possession. The restaurant owner was taken in for questioning, as there was reason to believe he had assassinated the king. However, he claimed he had no idea of the king's identity. Otherwise, he would have ensured the king suffered much more. The owner also mentioned that there had been a young woman dining with the king that night, possibly his mistress, and they had argued during the meal. Back at the morgue, Henry instructed Lucas to check the king's private but smelly areas. Lucas doubted that a man in his 70s would still be sexually active, but Henry insisted he had seen older men with plenty of vitality. Just as Lucas was about to proceed, Henry noticed a stamp on the deceased's hand. Lucas immediately recognized it as a nightclub's logo, confirming that the king had indeed been active for his age. Henry and Joe went to the nightclub, where the receptionist instantly recognized the elderly man's photo. There weren't many patrons in their 70s. Following the receptionist's directions, they found the young woman, a blonde with blue eyes. Upon hearing that the old man had passed away, the blonde shared the backstory. A month ago, the king had approached her, claiming that she was his illegitimate daughter. Because of his need for secrecy and fear of his wife finding out, he had arranged for the blonde to be raised by another family. During their last meeting, the king revealed the truth, admitting he was royalty and asking the blonde to return to his country with him. He even gave her a large amount of diamonds, but the blonde didn't believe him, which led to the argument at the restaurant. Henry then told the blonde that the old man had indeed been the king and the diamonds were real. The blonde was stunned, struggling to maintain her composure. In an instant, she went from almost becoming a princess to truly being an orphan. Life's ups and downs were overwhelming. Next, they visited the king's wife. The officer bluntly confronted her with the truth about her husband's affair and the diamonds given to his illegitimate daughter. They suspected that she had taken drastic measures to prevent the king from leaving with his wealth. Unexpectedly, the elderly woman became agitated upon hearing this and collapsed to the ground. Henry tested her and found that she had also been poisoned with the radioactive substance. There was no time to call an ambulance. Emergency treatment was needed immediately. Henry instructed the officer to detach a water pipe and insert it into the woman's mouth for a makeshift airway. Luckily, she miraculously survived. Later, Henry noticed fingerprints on the door clearly left by the murderer, and they matched the ink from the embassy. It was highly likely that someone from the embassy had orchestrated everything to prevent the king from returning home. They headed to the embassy, but the ambassador refused to reveal any information about the staff. Since the embassy is foreign territory, there was nothing they could do. Just then, the ambassador discreetly mentioned that someone claiming to be the king's daughter had visited him. Realizing the girl was in danger, Henry rushed out. Jo was about to follow when the ambassador called her back. It turned out he had hidden the staff records inside a newspaper. The embassy was clearly under surveillance, and many things had to be done secretly. Henry and Jo drove towards the blonde's house. Upon arriving home, the blonde received a call from Jo, warning her that she was in danger and to lock all doors and windows. The murderer who had killed her father was now after her. Before Jo could finish speaking, the blonde noticed that her window had been opened. Someone had already broken into her house. At that moment, a stranger appeared behind her. It turned out he was an embassy staff member whose parents had been persecuted by the former king, and he was out for revenge, determined to take down anyone connected to the royal family. Even though the blonde was just the former king's illegitimate daughter, the man showed no mercy. He grabbed her by her chicken throat, ready to make her pay with her life, when a baby's cry suddenly echoed through the room. The man was immediately drawn to the sound and released the girl. Seeing his intentions, the blonde desperately begged for mercy. The man punched her unconscious and quickly went into the room, blinded by his hatred. He then pulled out a gun and aimed it at the baby. Just as he was about to pull the trigger, Jo kicked the door open. The man, realizing he was cornered, fled the scene. Henry rescued the baby while Jo chased after the man. In the dark, the blonde saw the man and warned Jo to be careful, but her voice revealed her location, and she was shot by the man. Fortunately, Henry arrived just in time. Wounded, the blonde was rushed into an ambulance. She begged Henry to save her, as she was an orphan and didn't want her child to grow up without a mother. Henry remembered the blonde's father. History had an uncanny way of repeating itself. 60 years ago, he had saved the king, and now he was saving the king's daughter. Henry comforted the blonde, and thankfully her life was no longer in danger due to the timely rescue. Jo, holding the baby, came over, her maternal instincts overflowing. She decided to take care of the baby until the blonde regained consciousness. Henry was surprised to see this softer side of Jo, who had always been so tough. At that moment, Henry had already decided on a name for their future child. Just then, a nurse came over, mistakenly assuming the baby was theirs, making Jo quite embarrassed as she hurriedly tried to explain. After a busy day, Henry returned to the antique shop, exhausted, only to be met with shocking news from his adoptive son, Abe. Abe had found his biological parents. It turned out that just the day before, the mysterious man who had lived for 2,000 years approached Abe and secretly left behind a family tree, revealing Abe's lineage. Abe researched it further, and to his astonishment, he discovered he was related to Henry by blood. 200 years ago, a gentleman had an illegitimate child who turned out to be Abe's grandfather, who was also Henry's uncle. This was the best news Henry had heard in 200 years. They both looked into the mirror to compare themselves. Sure enough, the resemblance in their foreheads was striking. Meanwhile, the king's wife arrived at the hospital and accepted her husband's illegitimate daughter, the blonde girl. At that moment, the blonde was no longer an orphan. The scene shifts to a woman with heavy makeup and an 80s-style leopard print outfit that left much to be desired. Just then, her phone rang, and someone on the other end seemed to be harassing her. After hanging up, the door slowly opened, and moments later, her lifeless body was found in a trash heap. Although Henry was not around, Jo and her colleague could tell it was a murder. The girl's carotid artery had been severed, and the weapon was found at the scene. During the autopsy, Henry discovered something surprising. The girl's nail polish, hairspray, and clothing were all from the 70s. Everything about her belonged to a bygone era. What had made her so obsessed with the past? Henry suspected it wasn't her own choice, but that she was trying to cater to someone else's tastes. The officer began checking missing persons reports and quickly found information on the girl. Her name was Sarah, a third-year university student. Her photos looked quite different from her actual appearance. Henry and Jo then spoke with Sarah's roommate, who said that Sarah was her best friend, but she had recently changed a lot. It wasn't just her appearance. Her behavior had also become increasingly secretive. She had been skipping all her classes except one, which she never missed. Henry and Jo decided to visit that class. When the lights came on, they were shocked to see who the teacher was. It was their acquaintance, Hannah. Hannah noticed Henry, too, her gaze carrying a hint of something deeper. She was a captivating and seductive enigma. After class, Henry warmly greeted her, only to learn that Hannah wasn't just a therapist, but also a psychology PhD at the university. Feeling out of their depth, they realized they had underestimated her. Sarah's sudden death was a blow to Hannah, who couldn't accept it. She felt a deep connection to Sarah. Both were orphans and had matured early. A few days before her death, Sarah had confided in Hannah, saying she was involved in a role-playing relationship. Hannah had advised her to just enjoy herself as long as she was happy. Now, feeling guilty as a teacher, she struggled with the fact that Sarah had been murdered. Meanwhile, Lucas searched for clues at the dump site. The officer, relaxed with his legs crossed, read a magazine while poor Lucas worked tirelessly, sifting through the garbage. A pile of junk mail with bloodstains caught his attention. All the mail came from the same apartment building, which might be where the murder had taken place. Henry and Jo went to the building and found that it was indeed Sarah's residence. Inside, everything was carefully curated to create a 70s atmosphere. On the floor, Henry spotted a blood stain, confirming that Sarah had died there. At that moment, Jo noticed a photo under the couch. Henry could tell it was taken in the 70s, and the woman in it resembled Sarah, wearing the same style of clothing and makeup, but it wasn't her. Henry speculated that this was the woman Sarah had been trying to impersonate. This brought back a memory for Henry. In 1982, on his anniversary with his second wife, Abigail, his wife had been growing old while he remained as youthful as ever, making her anxious. Henry had booked a fancy restaurant, but she had been too insecure to go out with him. With his patient encouragement, she eventually smiled. Jo suggested seeking help from Hannah. Not only was Hannah attractive, but she was also a psychology PhD and Sarah's teacher. After watching a video, Hannah concluded that the perpetrator was likely a controlling psychopath who had meticulously dressed Sarah and provided her with the apartment. Standing close together, Henry and Hannah shared a moment of intimacy, which Jo interrupted just in time to prevent anything inappropriate. Hannah believed that this was not about sexual fantasy. The killer was likely trying to recreate a lost lover or preserve a deeply buried memory. She estimated the culprit to be around 65 years old. Her insights as a psychologist proved valuable. Suddenly, Henry had an idea. He and Jo tracked down an older man who had rented the victim's apartment since 1978. When shown a picture of Sarah, the man claimed not to know her. Henry then produced the old photo resembling Sarah. The man still denied recognition, but when Henry folded the picture in front of him, he became visibly distressed, pleading with Henry not to damage it. He admitted that the woman in the photo was his late wife and confessed to killing Sarah. In the interrogation room, the man revealed that his wife had died many years ago, but he had never been able to move on from her loss. One day, he noticed Sarah in a crowd. She bore an uncanny resemblance to his late wife, as if she had come back to life. He provided Sarah with financial support, and she, in turn, played the role of his deceased wife. One day, Sarah told him that she was pregnant, shattering his fantasy and sending him into a spiral. In a fit of distress, he stabbed her with a fork. After confessing, the man even reenacted the stabbing motion. His confession seemed flawless, and everyone thought the case could be closed. However, Henry had a different opinion. He believed the man was lying because the wounds on Sarah's body didn't match the actions the man described. Jo thought Henry was just stirring up trouble and teased him, saying he should just ask Hannah out directly instead of using the case as an excuse. After all, being single for a long time was nothing to be embarrassed about. Her words left Henry speechless, surprised that she was still jealous over an unintentional gesture from that morning. It seemed Henry's irresistible charm was causing more trouble than expected. To everyone's surprise, Henry ended up going on a date with Hannah that very evening. Henry somehow managed to talk about Jo during his date with Hannah. After discussing Jo, he shifted the conversation to the case. Unexpectedly, Hannah found the case puzzling too. She explained that it was unlikely for someone to harm their fantasy object, as such individuals tend to see the person playing the role as the real thing. Henry and Hannah decided to visit Sarah's apartment and conduct a little role play of their own. Hannah would play the victim, and Henry would act as the killer. Even though the old man had confessed, they felt there was more to uncover. Their hunch paid off, and Henry soon found some clues. The old man had spilled a drink that night, and Hannah was fully absorbed in her role. Thankfully, Henry managed to stay focused and stop things from going too far. He discovered water stains on the couch, which contained traces of other substances. To determine what they were, he took Hannah back to the morgue, making it their third date spot of the day. Henry identified traces of poison in the spilled drink, proving that the old man was not the real killer. He had been drugged. The true perpetrator not only destroyed his fantasy, but also manipulated him into believing he had murdered Sarah. Henry's deduction left Hannah utterly captivated, leading to a passionate hormone yoga session. The next day, Henry arrived at the station with new evidence. The old man had been given a large dose of sedatives, after which the killer murdered Sarah and placed the weapon in the old man's hand. When he woke up, he mistakenly concluded that he was the murderer. Upon further investigation, they discovered that the old man had a daughter who had run away at 15 and was imprisoned for drug possession 2 years ago. She had just been released from prison last month. Henry and Jo tracked down the girl, who was working at a coffee shop. She explained that one day, someone who looked remarkably like her late mother walked past the shop, wearing the exact same clothes her mother used to wear. She followed the woman, but it was clear that she was not her mother. Jo showed her a picture of Sarah, but the girl said it wasn't the same person she had seen. If this mysterious woman wasn't Sarah, then who could she be? Henry suddenly realized that Sarah had been imitating someone else, while another person was imitating Sarah. The old man had been obsessed with his deceased wife, but who would be obsessed with Sarah and could easily access her clothes? They both thought of Sarah's roommate. Meanwhile, the roommate had already sought out Hannah, saying she wanted to change her major. When Hannah asked why she was interested in psychology, the roommate explained that Sarah had been greatly influenced by Hannah, and she admired Sarah deeply. Hannah then noticed something odd. The roommate was wearing Sarah's clothes, and her obsession with Sarah had reached a disturbing level. Realizing that the roommate might be the killer, Hannah quickly made an excuse to send her away, fully aware that she had just come face to face with the true culprit. After the roommate left, Hannah quickly picked up the phone in her office to call the forensics department, but Henry wasn't there. At that moment, Hannah caught a glimpse of the roommate on the computer screen. Realizing the danger, she turned around, but it was too late. The roommate struck her hard, knocking her unconscious. Meanwhile, Henry and Jo arrived at the roommate's dorm, unaware that Hannah was in danger. They couldn't find the roommate, but Henry noticed her class schedule on the desk. She had kept only one class, Hannah's. Henry immediately realized that Hannah was in trouble. Elsewhere, the roommate was angrily confronting Hannah, demanding to know why she had exposed her. She was highly agitated, wielding a weapon in her hand. She claimed that she had only wanted to save Sarah from the creepy old man and hadn't intended to kill her. Clearly, her mental state was unstable. At that critical moment, Henry and Jo located them. The roommate grabbed hold of Hannah and stabbed her in her chick neck, preventing her from calling for help in her chicken voice. In the nick of time, Henry burst through the door. The roommate released Hannah, and Jo quickly restrained her. Hannah was rushed to the hospital, and after emergency treatment, she was fortunately out of danger. The scene shifts to a man running for Secretary of Defense who was giving a televised campaign speech broadcast worldwide when suddenly the background screen was hacked and his secrets were exposed to the public. It was clear that his political career was over. Shortly afterward, a hacker group rose to fame, gaining a reputation for justice by uncovering lies and corruption. Abe saw them as warriors for truth, though Henry couldn't quite understand, believing that warriors didn't hide behind masks. Then they got a call from Jo. There was a new case. A young man had died peacefully in his bed. Upon inspection, Henry found that he had died from asphyxiation, but there were no injuries and no signs of struggle. Henry detected a peculiar smell on the curtains. It was mercaptan, a gas heavier than air that, while non-toxic, could displace oxygen and easily cause suffocation. Suddenly, the room lit up. The dead man's alarm clock had gone off. Henry noticed that all the appliances in the home were connected to the man's smartphone. At that moment, the colleague discovered a mask hidden in a compartment of the wardrobe. They immediately recognized it. It was the symbol of the hacker group, suggesting that the young man was one of their members. Further investigation revealed that the man, Eric, had no known enemies. The officer questioned his neighbors and co-workers but found no useful leads. Then, two strangers approached, interrupting their conversation. The newcomers introduced themselves as members of the cybercrime unit and described the hacker group as cyber terrorists, a secret political organization. They confirmed that the killer had indeed used the victim's home network to carry out the murder. Last year, the hacker group had targeted 11 individuals, all powerful figures in business and politics, leading investigators to suspect that one of them was retaliating against the group. Since this was a cybercrime, the best way to find the killer was through the internet. That meant Jo and her colleague were out of their depth for this part. Jo went to find Henry, who was conducting the autopsy. To determine the density and diffusion rate of the mercaptan, Henry decided to experience it firsthand, a type of investigation Jo had been eagerly anticipating. Henry's decision thrilled her. It seemed she was getting increasingly drawn into Henry's unconventional methods. So, Jo and Henry lay down on the victim's bed together. The atmosphere in such close quarters had a hint of intimacy. Even before the gas took effect, the air was already thick with tension. Just then, the detector in Henry's hand went off, signaling that the gas concentration was high enough. Henry removed his mask, and after experiencing the effects firsthand, he concluded that the victim hadn't died from mercaptan-induced suffocation. They returned to the autopsy room, where Henry shaved a patch of the victim's beard and found faint bruising underneath, indicating that someone had strangled him. There had been another person in the room during the time of death. Just as Henry was about to inform his colleague, the colleague announced that they had already caught the killer. The cybercrime unit had traced the device controlling the victim's phone and used advanced technology to pinpoint the suspect's IP address. Henry, however, after his hands-on investigation and the additional evidence from the autopsy, reached a different conclusion. The victim wasn't killed through hacking but was strangled by hand. The candidate was brought in for questioning, but he seemed unaware of the crime, claiming he was being framed. Since the candidate had been recorded by hackers during a gathering, Henry and Jo headed to the restaurant where the footage was taken, suspecting that the victim, Eric, had also been there. At the restaurant, a girl with a distinctive tattoo on her back caught Henry's attention. Henry and Jo questioned her and showed her a photo of Eric, but she claimed not to know him. Henry, however, sensed she was lying. He believed she not only knew Eric, but was close to him. The evidence was that a piercing in her eyebrow matched a faint scratch on Eric's forehead, likely from an intimate moment between them. Realizing she'd been caught in her lie, the girl panicked and made a run for her shitty life. A chase ensued through the streets, but with a simple press of her phone, she managed to manipulate the traffic lights, causing chaos and escaping right under their noses. But all wasn't lost. They recovered her dropped phone. After some investigation, they identified her as Liz, a former student expelled for damaging property and hacking into systems, including leaking the names and addresses of those who visited adult websites. That revelation might have some people trembling in fear. As for how she manipulated the traffic system, the cybercrime team suspected she had help. Using her last known message, they quickly tracked down a suspect. The cybercrime unit had encountered him before, so they easily found him. He admitted to being in the victim's room that night. It turned out that the suspect was also a member of the hacker group, and he, Eric, and Liz made up a small cell within it. They had cracked the city's entire network system, making tampering with traffic lights a trivial task. Eric and Liz had once been a couple, but the suspect discovered that Eric had cheated on her, which he found baffling. To him, Liz wasn't just attractive, she was a genius. He had informed Liz about Eric's betrayal, but claimed not to know her whereabouts now. Henry returned to the morgue to continue searching for clues, but he was startled to find his computer had been hacked by none other than Liz. She had dug into Henry's background and discovered that all of his records dated back only 6 years and were falsified. Liz seemed to have uncovered Henry's secret and tried to blackmail him into issuing a fake death certificate. This revelation left Henry deeply shocked and brought back memories of a long-buried past. In 1865 London, Henry made headlines for his work as a physician, even charming a young nurse at the hospital. After a moment of intimacy, the nurse revealed a shocking piece of news. An elderly woman claiming to be his wife had arrived at the hospital. Intrigued, Henry sought out the woman, and to his surprise, it was indeed his first wife. Years ago, Henry had confided in his first wife about the secret of his immortality, but she had him committed to an asylum where he suffered at the hands of others. The woman had tracked him down through the newspaper. When she saw Henry again, she finally believed what he had told her all those years ago. His youthful appearance was undeniable proof. Overcome with emotion, she fainted on the spot. After regaining consciousness, she demanded that Henry reveal his secret to the world. He pleaded with her not to ruin his life once more. But just a few days later, his first wife confronted him again, this time with a gun in hand, threatening to expose his secret. She pulled the trigger, but the young nurse shielded Henry, taking the bullet for him using her chicken muscles. Once again, his past had destroyed his chance at a normal life. Back at his antique shop, Henry stared at a death certificate in his hand. If he wanted a peaceful existence, he would have to break his own principles. He had seen plenty of blackmail, but this was the first time someone was extorting him for a death certificate, putting him in a difficult position. Meanwhile, the cybercrime unit was using an advanced facial recognition system to track down the hacker, Liz. With such powerful surveillance, not even a person picking their nose on the street could go unnoticed. But Liz was no ordinary hacker. She managed to slip into Henry's antique shop. She not only knew about Henry's falsified identity, but also had found a photo of him from a century ago. All this effort just for a death certificate. She claimed she hadn't killed Eric. In fact, Eric hadn't been cheating on her. It was all a part of their plan to use seduction to gain access to the city's codes. Now that her boyfriend was dead, she feared she would be the next target. She begged Henry to help her by faking her death. Otherwise, she'd expose his secret to Jo. Reluctantly, Henry handed her the pre-prepared death certificate along with some advice from experience. Secrets are always revealed eventually, and she would never truly be herself again. New beginnings would always be out of reach. Liz said she was willing to take the risk, but Henry unexpectedly tore up the certificate, deciding to take a risk of his own. Furious, Liz left, throwing one last threat over her shoulder as she stormed out. Meanwhile, the cybercrime team spotted Liz on surveillance and alerted Jo. Just as Liz was about to use her phone to expose Henry's secret, something unexpected happened. As she crossed the street, a car hit her, sending her flying like a Barbie toy. Liz lay motionless on the ground. Jo arrived at the scene, which appeared to be a traffic accident. Liz was rushed to the hospital, where she was placed on life support with little chance of recovery. With her condition critical, a key lead was seemingly lost. The cybercrime team soon arrived at the hospital, suspecting it wasn't an accident at all. They believed a hacker had tampered with the traffic system, changing the lights to orchestrate Liz's accident. This meant Liz was still in danger, even in the hospital, as a hacker could potentially infiltrate medical equipment to finish the job. To protect her, they decided to disconnect the hospital from the internet. Back at the station, the team continued interrogating the suspect. Upon hearing that Liz was in critical condition, he seemed genuinely terrified, fearing for his own life. He believed he was in danger because the city's codes had been altered, and only someone within law enforcement would have that level of access. Meanwhile, Henry and an employee from the cybercrime unit were in the hospital room. With nothing else to do, they started chatting, and what Henry learned was startling. The employee was actually the deceased Eric's lover. Eric had seduced her to get access to the city's codes. Once he had what he needed, he went back to Liz, which prompted the employee to try to kill him using the city's network. That night, she went to Eric's apartment to wipe the information from his computer, only to find that he was still alive. She then suffocated him with her hands. Realizing she had been exposed, the cybercrime employee dropped the pretense and revealed her true intentions. She had one final card to play. It turned out the employee knew that Liz had contacted Henry, and she had also hacked into Henry's files using her advanced network skills. She had discovered Henry's secret. At that moment, Liz began to cough, her oxygen levels dropping dangerously low, but no alarm sounded. The employee had already disabled the hospital's systems. She pulled out Liz's oxygen tube in front of Henry, confident that he would compromise his principles to protect his secret. Henry found himself at a crossroads, but in the end, his principles triumphed over self-interest. He activated the emergency alarm and began administering first aid to Liz. For 200 years, he had never forgotten his original purpose, to be a doctor who saves lives. As he worked to save Liz, the cybercrime employee slipped out of the room. With all eyes on her, she walked straight into the middle of the street. She had been used by the hackers, who not only tricked her into giving them the city's codes, but also deceived her emotionally. The scene shifts to an old sea captain who was found dead aboard his ship, a vintage harpoon piercing his hairy chest. Back at the morgue, Henry conducted an autopsy and found air bubbles in the captain's lungs, suggesting he had recently been underwater. Lucas discovered traces of gold leaf on the captain's teeth, indicating he had salvaged gold from the seabed, likely testing its authenticity by biting it. The investigation led them to the captain's warehouse, where they hoped to find more answers. To Henry's shock, the captain had recovered a sunken ship. It's the African Queen, the same vessel on which Henry had died for the first time. Memories flooded back to him. Nearly 200 years had passed, but he still recalled the events on that ship vividly. It had been a cargo vessel carrying slaves, and it was part of his own family's business. Henry had tried to atone for his father's sins in his own way. He had secretly approached a slave and told him that he would steal the keys that night, instructing him to gather everyone in the armory. But Henry never returned. The captain shot him dead and threw his body into the sea. Henry carried the guilt of that night, believing it was his actions that had doomed the lives of 300 slaves. His immortality felt like a curse from above, condemning him to live in perpetual anguish. However, Abe noticed a discrepancy, wondering how could a cargo ship that had been sailing in the Pacific end up thousands of miles away off the coast of New York. There had to be secrets yet to be uncovered. Abe encouraged Henry to pull himself together and search for answers. Joe suspected that the captain had indeed salvaged gold, but none was found in the warehouse. They soon identified 3 suspects, all crew members who had participated in the salvage operation. Henry asked the sheriff for permission to participate in the interrogation, claiming he was familiar with the world of sailors. The sheriff agreed on the condition that Henry follow orders. As the questioning began, Henry unexpectedly asked a series of unrelated questions, leaving the sheriff and Joe frustrated. After 2 unhelpful interrogations, it became clear that none of the suspects knew how the captain had found the shipwreck. With the captain dead, the location of the sunken ship and the whereabouts of the gold remained a mystery. Fortunately, the 3rd suspect, a young woman, knew a bit more. She mentioned that the captain had used a map to locate the wreck, but with him gone, the map's whereabouts were also unknown. The sheriff, losing patience with Henry's focus on the sunken ship and the map rather than the gold, removed him from the investigation. Kicked out of the interrogation, Henry had no choice but to return to Abe to discuss their next steps. That night, Henry and Abe secretly returned to the warehouse to look for clues, only to discover that someone else had also broken in and was rummaging around. To protect the antiques from being damaged, Henry revealed himself to stop the intruder. The person fled, and Henry chased him outside the warehouse, where Joe had already set up an ambush. The suspect was swiftly apprehended. Joe covered for Henry in her report, omitting his and Abe's involvement, but she couldn't understand why Henry was more obsessed with the shipwreck than the case itself. During the interrogation, it was revealed that the suspect was the captain's old partner. He and the captain had discovered the African Queen years ago, but had been forced to abandon the salvage due to inadequate equipment, which had led to a crew member's death. The operation was put on hold until recently. Upgrading the equipment required millions, so the suspect assumed that the captain must have found an investor. Meanwhile, Henry opened a coffin recovered from the sunken ship. After 200 years, the body inside had decayed to a skeleton, but Henry immediately recognized it as belonging to the same enslaved man he had tried to help. However, slaves who died aboard were usually thrown into the sea. Why had this man received a proper burial? Turning to a guy named Monroe, who had become quite wealthy. He invested millions to salvage the wreck and had reaped a fortune many times over in gold. While others admired his wealth, Monroe made a surprising choice. He donated all the gold. The crowd applauded Monroe's altruism, and he clearly enjoyed the attention. He even flirted with Joe in front of everyone. After the speech, Henry and Joe confronted Monroe, arguing that the gold rightfully belonged to the captain. But Monroe countered that he and the captain had signed an agreement stating that all salvaged items belonged to him. Just then, a banquet staff member approached Henry, saying he had a phone call. Puzzled as to who would call him there, Henry excused himself. Meanwhile, Monroe continued to flirt with Joe and even asked her out on a date. Henry answered the phone only to find that it was Adam, the mysterious man who claimed to be 2,000 years old, and he was standing right behind him. Adam not only knew the secrets of the African Queen, but also everything that had happened to Henry aboard the ship. It seemed Adam had been secretly investigating him for some time. With age, nothing remains a secret for long. Adam asked Henry what weapon had killed him for the first time, and Henry, despite being over 2 centuries old, answered that it was the captain's musket. To Henry's astonishment, Adam had located the very same musket that had killed him. He could hardly believe that he was looking at the weapon that had ended his life for the first time. At that moment, Jo arrived, but the mysterious Adam had already sensed her approach and slipped out of the room. The next day, as soon as Jo arrived at the police station, she found a large bouquet of roses waiting for her, clearly a gift from Monroe, who was obviously smitten. Even the officer thought she should consider going on a date with Monroe, especially since he had checked Monroe's alibi and found that he was accounted for on the night the captain died. At the forensics lab, Lucas brought in a box for Henry. It turned out to be a gift as well. Adam had sent him the gun. Lucas jokingly remarked that the pistol's performance was terrible, with an accurate range of only 5 meters. He teased that anyone who got killed by this gun must have been a real fool. Henry was taken aback by the unexpected jab. He snatched the magazine from Lucas's hands and dismissed him, but as he glanced at the magazine, a photo caught his eye. It was of a man who had perished during the first attempt to salvage the African Queen. He had heterochromia, just like the girl involved in the case, indicating that they were siblings. It seemed the murder wasn't about gold at all. It was a matter of the girl's revenge. Henry shared his theory with the officer, who informed him that Jo had gone on a date. By then, Jo was already at Monroe's house, an unusually intimate choice for a first date. It was quite bold of her, and Monroe seemed rather eager as well. To avoid interruptions, Jo had even switched off her phone. While the two were enjoying the romantic atmosphere, they were unaware that danger was lurking nearby. The vengeful girl had broken in downstairs. As Monroe passionately pursued Jo with his words, she felt a bit overwhelmed and excused herself to go to the bathroom. The vengeful girl was already climbing the stairs, and the two women narrowly missed encountering each other. Inside the bathroom, Jo was debating whether to stay or leave, while the vengeful girl made the decision for her by knocking out Monroe. When Jo returned, she recognized the vengeful girl, unaware that she was the one who had killed the captain. Just then, Henry arrived at the house. The knocking on the door distracted the vengeful girl, giving Jo a chance to engage her in a struggle. Music was playing in the background, so the officer, hearing the commotion, assumed that Jo and her date were just having a bit of fun. Nevertheless, he continued knocking when there was no answer. The struggle between the two women intensified, and as the noise grew louder, Henry realized that it didn't sound like a romantic rendezvous. The officer kicked down the door, and they managed to regain control of the situation. Back at the station, the truth was revealed. The vengeful girl had blamed the captain for her brother's death at sea and had been seeking revenge. When she saw Monroe funding the salvage operation, she decided he was also responsible and had broken into his home to confront him. Fortunately, Jo had been there to save Monroe's life. Monroe's infatuation with Jo only deepened, and even the sheriff noticed, making sure to give the two some space. Despite his unremarkable appearance, Monroe was a genuine charmer. He joked that she should leave her gun at home for their next date, then headed off, ready to call it a night. As he was leaving, Monroe was surprised to find Henry waiting for him. Henry had many questions and had deduced that Monroe was the one who had located the African Queen. Monroe explained everything. There had been a sailor aboard the ship who had hand-drawn a map, which Monroe used to find the wreck's location. He also shared a little-known story. At the time, there was a doctor aboard the African Queen who had been shot dead by the captain. As the crew carried his body away, a key fell from his hand. The young slave found the key and used it to free all the slaves. The freed slaves rose up, took control of the ship, and ultimately gained their freedom. Before the vessel sank, they were fortunate enough to reach land and escape to freedom. Though all those who lived through that story were long gone, the tale and the map had continued to be passed down through the generations. Hearing this news, Henry felt relieved. For 200 years, the memory had haunted him, but today he could finally let it go. What Monroe didn't know was that the man standing before him was the very person who had helped the enslaved men get the key all those years ago. Back at home, Henry and Abe opened a bottle of red wine to celebrate the revelation. Just then, Henry received a call from Adam, who instructed him to take good care of the gun. Henry couldn't understand why this musket was so important. Adam revealed his own secret. 2,000 years ago, he had been stabbed in the stomach with a dagger. That was his first death, and it was excruciatingly painful. But after gaining immortality, he began to long for that sensation. Adam believed that perhaps the weapons that first killed them might hold the power to truly end their lives. Unfortunately, his own dagger had been lost, so he couldn't test his theory. He hoped Henry could test it for him. With that, Adam hung up and walked toward the edge of a high-rise building. The scene shifts to Jo being on another date with the wealthy Monroe. Determined to win her over, Monroe went all out, even purchasing the city's landmark bar. While they were there, Jo noticed someone pulling out a bag of powder. Her instinct was to reach for her sidearm, only to remember that she hadn't brought her gun tonight. Monroe urged her to ignore it, telling her to just be a regular person for the night. But things quickly took a turn when the guitarist on stage got a bit too wild, repeatedly smashing his guitar against the backdrop wall. The wall broke open, revealing a mummified body inside. It looked like the date was ruined once again. In the morgue, Henry examined the mummified body, which was remarkably well preserved thanks to being sealed within the wall. Just then, the phone in the forensics office rang. The caller wanted to speak to the person in charge of the case. Joe took the call, and the caller asked directly if the deceased was Ruth. Intrigued by his certainty, Joe asked him to come to the station, as the identity of the body had yet to be confirmed. But the caller explained that he couldn't leave. He was calling from prison, where he was serving time for Ruth's murder. Henry and Joe visited the prison, bringing along a restored photograph of the victim for identification. The man, Simon, immediately recognized the woman in the photo as Ruth. They had been members of the same band, and Simon had been deeply in love with her. But one day Ruth disappeared, and Simon was accused of her murder. He lost both his lover and his freedom, ending up in prison for a crime he didn't commit. Simon had been behind bars for over 20 years, which reminded Henry of a painful part of his own past. In 1985, his second wife, Abigail, disappeared after leaving behind a letter. Heartbroken, Henry had turned to the police for help. Abigail had been 64 years old at the time, and she had left of her own volition. But Henry couldn't accept that reality. After reading the letter, the sheriff concluded that she simply didn't want to be found, and they refused to assist Henry in his search. Back at the morgue, Henry conducted another examination of the restored body and found tiny puncture wounds on the victim's calf, the cause of which remained unclear. The cause of death was a blow to the back of the head with a sharp object. Henry reviewed the conviction report from over 20 years ago, which accused Simon of killing Ruth with a guitar. However, after repeated tests, Henry and Lucas concluded that the guitar was not the murder weapon, indicating that Simon was not the killer. Henry believed the case needed to be reopened. But then Joe informed him that Simon was downstairs in the conference room about to sign a confession agreement. His sentence had already been served, and if he signed the agreement, he would be released immediately. Henry could not accept this outcome. He believed the truth needed to come out. Then Morgan burst into the conference room and shared his thoughts with Simon. Although signing would grant him freedom, it also meant the case would be closed and the police would stop investigating, leaving Ruth's death without any truth. After hearing Morgan's argument, Simon decided to give up his freedom. He had already served 20 years in prison and didn't care about spending a few more. He was determined to uncover the truth. Simon refused to plead guilty. The prosecutor stated that the agreement would expire in 48 hours, meaning Morgan had to find the killer within 2 days, or Simon could end up spending another 10 years in prison. In the morgue, Joe discovered a wad of cash in the victim's clothing. Henry and Lucas then headed to the bar, suspecting the owner because his fingerprints were found on the cash. Henry planned to obtain a sample of the bar owner's DNA by getting a strand of his hair, but to his surprise, the bar owner was now bald. Time had certainly taken its toll. He was whispering sweet nothings into a girl's ear, so Henry decided to collect DNA from one of the glasses the bar owner had used. He discreetly pocketed a few glasses and even slipped some into Lucas's pockets. Just then, a burly man approached and dragged Henry over to the bar owner. Initially, the bar owner thought Henry was with the Narcotics Bureau, but upon learning he was a forensic pathologist, he denied any involvement in a murder. In a bold move, Henry handed the bar owner a glass, asking him to spit in it for DNA testing. This provocation angered the bar owner, and the burly man threw Henry out of the bar. Undeterred, Henry sneaked back inside and found the girl the bar owner had been whispering to. Since the bar owner had just bitten her ear, there was likely DNA on it. Henry quickly collected a sample from her ear, but the burly man spotted him, and once again he and Lucas were thrown out. As the burly man was about to rough Henry up, Joe arrived just in time to intervene, saving Henry from a beating. Despite the commotion, he had successfully obtained the bar owner's DNA. The next day, the bar owner was brought in for questioning. He admitted that the money was his but claimed Ruth hadn't stolen it. Rather, she had given it to him. According to the bar owner, Ruth was a friend who had just completed rehab and was planning to leave town to start a new life, so he had helped her out. He also mentioned that there were financial conflicts within Ruth's band, giving Joe a new direction for the investigation. The band originally had 4 members. 1 was dead, 1 was in prison, and only 2 remained. After reviewing their photos, Henry said there was only one viable suspect left, as he could tell from the photos that the other remaining member had health issues and likely wasn't alive anymore. Jo verified this on the computer, confirming that the person had indeed died 20 years ago. Henry and Jo went to visit the bassist at his home, only to find that he was now a stay-at-home dad. However, his eldest daughter seemed to be following in his rebellious footsteps, a classic troubled teenager. Henry's attention was drawn to a spiked bracelet on the girl's wrist. It matched the puncture wounds on the victim's leg. The girl explained that it used to belong to her father. Henry and Jo privately questioned the bassist, who surprised them by admitting that he had caused the injuries on Ruth's leg and that he was the one who hid her body in the wall. However, he insisted that he hadn't killed Ruth, believing that Simon was responsible. He recounted that on the day of the incident, the band had been rehearsing at the bar when Ruth, who had been missing for a long time, suddenly showed up. Simon, angry at Ruth's disappearance, dragged her backstage and assaulted her. When things quieted down, the bassist went in and found Ruth's lifeless body, while Simon had disappeared. To protect Simon and the band, he hid Ruth's body in the wall. The bassist even produced the knife from that night, which, after testing, was found to have Ruth's blood and Simon's fingerprints on it. All the evidence pointed to Simon. Back in the morgue, Henry created a 3D model of Ruth's skull to closely match it against the weapon, and he discovered subtle differences that would have been impossible to detect without his 200 years of forensic experience. Lucas thought he had an idea and dug up an old magazine that documented the crime scene. He suggested that the weapon might have been a large nail protruding from the wall. Henry and Jo revisited the scene of the crime. Though the location had changed dramatically over the past 2 decades and the nail was no longer there, Henry managed to find the original position of the nail by tracing the marks on the wall. Its height matched the wound on Ruth's skull. Henry speculated that Simon and Ruth did have a fight, but Simon left through the back door afterward. Someone else then entered, pushed Ruth against the wall, and the nail pierced her head. The killer would have then pulled Ruth's body off the nail and laid her on the floor. There had to be traces left behind. Sure enough, they found a fingerprint on the wall. Back at the station, they shared their new findings with the sheriff, but to their dismay, he informed them that the case had already been closed. Simon had just signed the confession agreement, having given up hope and accepting reality in exchange for his freedom. This outcome frustrated Henry. The real killer was still at large, and there seemed to be nothing he could do. Despite this setback, Lucas delivered Ruth's toxicology report. Given her history of drug use, Henry was stunned to see that Ruth had been clean for 8 months. This led him to a new possibility, so he decided to examine Ruth's uterus. His suspicions were confirmed. Ruth had been pregnant. Perhaps she had gone into hiding because of the pregnancy, and after realizing she couldn't forget Simon, she returned to reconcile with him. But maybe the father of the child was the one who killed her. Jo pointed out that the case was officially closed, and any further investigation would be illegal. Henry asked her to keep it a secret, as he intended to pursue the truth on his own. They pulled the child's birth records, which led them to the home of the child's father. When the man saw Henry and Jo at his door, he knew that the moment of reckoning had come. It's revealed that Ruth had approached the man when she found out she was pregnant, asking for his help because she didn't want to burden Simon, hoping he could continue focusing on his music career. The man helped Ruth get clean, but after giving birth, she wanted to return to Simon. This devastated the man, and in a moment of anguish, he accidentally killed Ruth. Jo arrested the man, but as they stepped outside, they ran into Simon, who had just been released after signing the confession agreement. He was holding a gun, pointing it at everyone, convinced that Ruth had betrayed him. He wanted revenge against the man, who had let him take the blame for over 20 years. Henry quickly revealed the truth to Simon, but this only deepened his despair. The man had destroyed everything good in his life. At that moment, a young boy appeared, breaking the tense atmosphere. He was the man's son, or more accurately, Simon and Ruth's son. Seeing the son he had never met, Simon's anger seemed to dissipate. He lowered the gun and let go of his hatred. The truth had finally come out, but the lost years could never be recovered. Simon was free, but he had missed his son's entire childhood. Whether they could build a relationship now was something only time could tell. The scene shifts to a woman who was the most legendary ballerina of her time, and today was her farewell performance. Due to injuries, she had to leave the stage she loved, but she was not the main character today. One person's exit often marks another's rise. The dance director planned to use this opportunity to promote a newcomer named Ava. However, after waiting for a long time, Ava still hadn't emerged from the dressing room, and she was nowhere to be found. Suddenly, a chicken's scream echoed through the venue. The cleaning lady had discovered a bloody human foot. Meanwhile, Jo was on yet another date with Monroe, but once again, the date was interrupted by a call from the station. Henry and Jo arrived at the scene. After a careful examination, Henry concluded that the foot had been sawed off while the person was still alive, possibly because it's too stinky. However, they found no other remains, and Ava was the only person missing. An investigation revealed that the stinky foot did indeed belong to Ava, who had grown up in the slums. She was on the verge of becoming the principal dancer, only to face this tragedy. Jo interviewed Eva's colleagues and friends but found no leads. Without a body, it was impossible to confirm this as a murder case. In the morgue, Henry examined the smelly foot closely and noticed that the owner had severe injuries from years of dance, and there were signs of injections, possibly a treatment. Later, the officer found Eva's car, and inside the trunk, they discovered bloodstains. Henry immediately noticed something was off. The amount of blood was too little. If someone's stinky foot was severed while they were alive, there should have been a lot more blood unless someone had stopped the bleeding, suggesting that Ava might still be alive. He carefully searched the car, knowing that time was of the essence. The sooner they found Ava, the better her chances of survival. Jo questioned Ava's dance director, who had planned for her to replace the legendary ballerina. This decision had stirred up jealousy among the other dancers, including the ballerina herself. However, the director didn't believe anyone would go so far as to harm Ava. At that moment, a makeup mirror caught the officer's attention. After some processing, a message appeared on the mirror warning, "If she dares to dance, prepare to die." They tracked down the ballerina, and Jo became suspicious of her bodyguard, whose eyes appeared irritated, as if he had been sprayed with pepper spray. They found a can of pepper spray in Ava's bag and took both of them in for questioning. The ballerina admitted that she had ordered her bodyguard to follow Ava and had threatened her, trying to rattle her nerves and make her slip up during the performance. She wasn't pleased that a girl from the slums was set to take her place. However, she denied any involvement in harming Eva, and her bodyguard confirmed that he had indeed followed Eva on the day she disappeared, with the pepper spray incident happening then. He mentioned that it was raining that day, and he saw Ava lingering around a statue near the entrance. Hearing this, Henry interrupted the interrogation and headed straight for the statue with others. Jo was annoyed, thinking they were wasting time while they still had suspects to question. But Henry insisted there had to be a clue there. Why else would Ava be wandering around a statue in the rain? Sure enough, Henry found a note of a motel address hidden inside the statue. It seemed like a rendezvous between two young lovers. They rushed to the motel and discovered a large amount of blood in the room. It appeared that things had taken a violent turn. But as they left the room, Henry noticed something unusual, a flock of birds circling overhead. This type of bird would only gather in search of food, which suggests that they might have found Ava's remains. When they entered, they discovered it was indeed Ava. Someone had brutally sawed off her stinky foot and left it in the icy wilderness. Fortunately, Henry arrived in time and the girl was rushed to the hospital for emergency treatment. She had survived but remained unconscious, unable to identify her attacker. Ava's brother requested that the police provide 24-hour protection for them. They had relied on each other since childhood and were each other's last family. Henry and Jo found Eva's dance director, suspecting that Eva's dance partner was also her lover and possibly her attacker. At that moment, Eva's male dance partner was rehearsing with a new partner, likely still adjusting to each other, which could lead to accidents. Henry stepped forward, trying to show his gentlemanly demeanor, and asked the girl if she was hurt. To his surprise, she pulled out a syringe, preparing to inject her ankle with medication. Henry urged her not to do that, but she replied that no one here cared about their health. For the sake of their dreams, they had no other choice. Just then, Jo received a call telling that Eva had awakened and revealed the name of her lover. Henry deduced from the posters on the wall that it was Eva's dance director, who had previously been a ballet dancer himself. The director was brought into the interrogation room where he admitted to having an affair with Ava and confirmed that he had written the note of the motel message, but that was a week ago. He denied any intention to harm her, claiming he loved her and intended to promote her as the principal ballerina, so it seemed he had no motive for the crime. Henry found Ava, but she said she had been unconscious at the time and didn't know who had sawed off her stinky foot. Just then, the attending physician entered the room. Henry asked if Eva would need to undergo amputation, but the doctor said that the person who had harmed her had done a good job of treating the wound. Henry was astonished. If the attacker intended to hurt her, why would they take such care in bandaging her? It was clear that the attacker had surgical experience. Henry shared his findings with Joe and the officer, which sparked a realization for the officer. He had investigated Eva's brother and discovered that the man had once been a battlefield surgeon. Initially, the officer hadn't thought much of it, but now it seemed like a crucial lead. He and Joe went to the man's home, but no one was there. Inside, the officer found tools that could have been used in the crime, indicating they were in the right place. Just then, Eva's brother returned from outside, and the two officers immediately moved to the living room. Faced with two loaded guns, Eva's brother did not surrender. Instead, he made a desperate attempt to escape. Ultimately, he found himself cornered on the rooftop, but he decided to take a risky leap, causing him to fall from the 100-foot building and meet his demise. Joe examined the man's tools, and all evidence pointed to him as the perpetrator. Henry was baffled. The siblings had always relied on each other. Eva's brother shouldn't have acted this way. Joe speculated that perhaps the brother feared that if Eva became successful, she would leave him behind. After Joe left, Lucas delivered the testing report on Eva's severed foot, revealing that she had been using a type of anti-arthritis medication. Henry immediately confirmed the findings with the stinky foot, discovering clear evidence of bone degeneration. He then approached Eva to validate his suspicions. It turned out that Eva had long known about her illness and that it wouldn't be long before she could no longer dance. With her career just beginning, she felt an intense frustration. To draw attention to herself, she conspired with her brother to stage a dramatic act by brutally severing her own foot. She successfully captured everyone's attention and became the center of the spotlight. Henry now understood the truth behind her actions, but with the suspect already dead and no evidence left, taking the case to court would likely lead to defeat and only add to the girl's legend. The case would have to be left unresolved. That evening, Joe was set to fly to Paris with Monroe for a vacation. She asked Henry for recommendations on places to visit, and he suggested that she simply pick a direction and get lost in the city. He believed that would be the most romantic way to spend time in Paris, provided she was with someone special. As Joe left the building and got into Monroe's car, Henry returned to his antique shop. For decades, his life had remained unchanged, with only Abe keeping him company. Just then, a knock at the door surprised him. It was Jo, wheeling her luggage behind her. Henry asked Jo why she hadn't left. She replied that she didn't want to go with Monroe. Curious, Henry pressed her for details, but just as Jo was about to express her hormone feelings, she was interrupted by Abe's voice. Abe's timing was impeccable, completely derailing his father's moment. He said he had something important to discuss with Henry privately. Jo sensed that today wasn't the right time for hormone confessions, so she decided to leave. Abe's cautious demeanor piqued Henry's curiosity. To his astonishment, Abe revealed that he had found his mother. The news struck Henry like a bolt from the blue, leaving him stunned. Years ago, when his wife disappeared, Henry had gone mad searching for clues, and Abe had hoped to help him move on by secretly disposing of all information about his mother. He had succeeded in making Henry give up the search, but what Henry didn't know was that Abe had continued his investigation in secret. He took it upon himself to find his mother and even had Lucas discreetly access hospital records under Henry's name. This led to a significant discovery. Abigail had worked there but had retired a long time ago. Henry could hardly believe that his long-lost wife had been so close all this time. Following the address in the records, he and Abe arrived at her home where they found a woman cleaning the yard. Upon approaching, they realized she wasn't the person they were looking for. The woman turned out to be the owner of the house that Abigail had rented many years ago. She mentioned that one morning, Abigail had simply vanished, and she had kept all her belongings, hoping she would return. At that moment, Henry noticed some roses in the garden, his wife's favorite flowers. It was clear that she had once planted them. Feeling nostalgic, Henry spotted an indentation in the ground resembling a body. His 200 years of forensic experience told him there was likely a decaying corpse beneath the surface. He began to dig through the soil and soon uncovered a skeleton, a sense of dread washing over him. The police arrived on the scene shortly after to take over the excavation. They found Abigail's jewelry, which seemed to confirm the identity of the deceased. Unable to face the reality of his wife's body, Henry asked Lucas to examine the remains. Lucas made his discovery. It was a female body that had been stabbed in the brain with a sharp object about 25 years ago. She had been alive at the time of the attack, dying in agony. Henry felt a deep pain at the thought of his wife suffering in such a way. Just then, Lucas noticed that the growth plates of the deceased were still open. Henry found this impossible. His wife was old. Curious, he leaned closer and confirmed it. This meant the deceased had only been 20 years old. The body was not his wife. Henry hurried back to the antique shop to share the news with his son, who was still engulfed in grief. The news seemed to pull him out of his sorrow, but it also made him wonder if there was any connection between the unidentified female corpse and his mother. Returning to the morgue, Henry conducted a thorough examination of the body and discovered that the deceased had suffered fractures in the hand and collarbone, which had been reset by someone, likely a medical professional. However, before the arm could heal, the victim had been attacked, suffering a fatal blow to the head. At that moment, Lucas uncovered information about a missing person who matched the body's description, a young woman named Linda, who had disappeared at the age of 20. Henry and Joe traced her history to a hospital where Linda's fractures had been treated. As it turned out, the nurse who cared for Linda was none other than Henry's wife, Abigail. An elderly nurse at the hospital recalled the events from back then. After tending to Linda, Abigail had been called to assist another critically injured patient who had been hit by a car in a hit-and-run accident. Once she finished her duties, Abigail took Linda home, assuming she was a victim of domestic abuse who was too afraid to return to her family. Henry and Joe then approached a judge who had admitted Linda to the hospital years ago. The judge explained that he had seen Linda injured after falling down some stairs at a party and had taken her to the hospital. However, Henry sensed there was more to the story. He confronted the judge, speculating that after the party, the judge had hit Linda with his car, severely injuring another person in the process, and had then killed Linda to keep the truth hidden. Faced with Henry's baseless accusations, the judge became furious and drove away. Back at the station, Joe was reprimanded by her superiors after the judge filed a complaint against them. Under pressure, the sheriff ordered her to drop the case. Nevertheless, Henry, Joe, and Lucas continued to investigate discreetly. Lucas brought an entire truckload of soil from where the body had been buried, searching for clues in Henry's underground lab. Meanwhile, the officer visited the hospital, attempting to find records of the patient admitted alongside Linda. To his surprise, the file had vanished, suggesting someone was trying to cover up the truth. Around the same time, Lucas found a button in the soil, sparking a revelation in Henry's mind. In a frenzy, he confronted the judge, demanding to know what had happened. The nurse who had taken in Linda was also Henry's wife, who was now missing. Pleading for the truth, Henry begged the judge to reveal what really occurred. However, before he could get an answer, courthouse security intervened, and Henry was escorted out and later detained. Joe visited Henry in custody. She had never seen him so agitated over a case and suspected there was more at stake than just the identity of Abe's mother. Then, unexpectedly, she received a call informing her that the judge had turned himself in at the police station. It emerged that 25 years ago, the judge had been driving with his mistress, Linda, when they hit a motorcyclist. The rider appeared to be gravely injured, and the judge wanted to call the police, but Linda stopped him. She had a boyfriend at the time and feared their affair would be exposed. Terrified, she mentioned that her boyfriend owned a gun, which explained why she had gone home with Abigail. That night, Henry and Joe returned to the crime scene. Henry believed there was a high probability that Abigail had not left the area alive. As he searched the yard, he stumbled upon a cellar filled with jars of homemade jam, something he recognized as his wife's handiwork. Just then, Joe received a call from the officer. Due to poor reception, she returned to the house to use the landline. The officer had checked Linda's visitor log from back then and found that no one had ever come to see her. He speculated that there was only one group of people exempt from filling out the visitor log: police officers. While Joe was on the phone, Henry made a discovery in the cellar, a police uniform that belonged to the town. However, just then he heard the distinct sound of a gun being cocked. The town sheriff had appeared behind him, and in that moment, Henry understood everything. The sheriff was Linda's boyfriend, and he was the one who had killed her. In his final moments, Henry asked him where the nurse who had taken care of Linda was. The sheriff clearly didn't want to waste any words and was about to pull the trigger, but Joe appeared from behind and subdued him. Back in the interrogation room, the sheriff finally revealed the truth. It turned out that on that day, he had taken the injured biker to the hospital, only to unexpectedly run into his girlfriend, Linda. Furious after learning the truth, he tracked her down. In a heated argument, he accidentally shoved her, causing her to fall and die on the spot. But what about Abigail? The sheriff said that before he entered the house, he saw her drive away with a man, and she never returned. Shortly after they left, the landlord arrived and knocked on the door repeatedly. The sheriff, hiding inside, didn't dare make a sound. After the landlord left, he buried Linda's body. Henry, however, found this explanation suspicious. If Abigail had left just a few minutes before the landlord came, the landlord should have encountered her on the dead-end road leading from the house. This led Henry to consider a new possibility. The car hadn't gone far at all. Henry and Jo rushed to the scene and began searching the roadside carefully. Sure enough, they made a discovery. An abandoned car stood hidden, nearly swallowed by leaves. There were no bodies inside, but as Henry cleared away the leaves from the front of the car, he uncovered a skeleton. There was no doubt it was Abigail. She had died there with no one to even bury her. Back at the autopsy room, Henry fought back his grief as he prepared the report. The car had plunged down a hill, and due to the impact, the victim was thrown through the windshield. The resulting chest fractures and deep cuts on her neck caused her to bleed to death. However, Lucas offered a different perspective. He suggested that the chest fractures were from overly forceful resuscitation attempts, and the cuts on the hyoid bone weren't caused by glass, but by a sharp blade. Lucas made an even more shocking discovery. The cuts on her bones indicated that the elderly woman hadn't been murdered. She had taken her own life with the knife. This suggested that she had been trying to escape from someone. Henry, caught up in his own emotions, was blind to the truth. Lucas's words were a harsh wake-up call. Back at the antique shop, Henry went over the case again, realizing they had missed a key figure. He thought of the biker who had been taken to the hospital but had no discharge records or death certificate. Henry remembered someone, and with a sense of urgency, he dialed a mysterious number. To his surprise, the person on the other end admitted everything. The scene flashes back to the severely injured Adam being taken to the hospital, but he begged the nurse to end his life. The nurse was shocked, but Adam revealed his secret. He had been alive for over 2,000 years and could resurrect after death. This entire story dated back more than 20 years. Adam shared this past with Henry. To Henry's surprise, the nurse in the story was his own wife. Adam hadn't expected that Abigail would believe him, but she did, because Henry also possessed the gift of immortality. At that moment, a nurse called Abigail away. After she left, Adam struggled to his feet and used an electric shock to end his life. When Abigail returned, she realized Adam had already resurrected. Her reaction made Adam suspect she had encountered other immortals before. After his rebirth, Adam tracked down Abigail at her home. Having lived for over 2,000 years, he had finally discovered that he wasn't alone. He demanded that Abigail tell him the whereabouts of other immortals. Fearing that Adam would harm Henry, she denied knowing anyone. But just as she was about to mislead him, Linda came downstairs. To protect Linda, Abigail agreed to take Adam to find another immortal. They got into a car, with Abigail believing that this was her only way to save Linda. Little did she know another man was hiding in the shadows, and ultimately, Linda was murdered. As they drove away, Abigail deliberately drove the car off a cliff. Severely injured and unconscious, Abigail lay motionless while Adam desperately tried to resuscitate her, knowing that only she could help him find the other immortals. Abigail finally awoke but immediately pulled a knife from Adam's belt and chose to end her own life. Henry now understood everything. His wife had chosen to end her life to protect him. Yet many years later, Adam managed to track down Henry on his own. The realization that Adam had caused Abigail's death tormented Henry. He knew that sooner or later he and Adam would have to face each other in a final confrontation. The scene shifts to a girl rummaging through a box when she accidentally cut her hand. To her surprise, the culprit was an ancient dagger. Soon after, her body was found beneath a bridge. Meanwhile, Henry and Abe were mourning Abigail, scattering her ashes into the river. Abe could tell that Henry wanted to avenge his mother, but he hoped Henry wouldn't go through with it. Their opponent was immortal, impossible to kill. Yet Henry was convinced that he had plenty of time and would eventually find a way. Later, Henry returned to the forensics lab to examine the girl's body and discovered metal fragments in her wound, likely from an ancient weapon. There were also traces of plastic dust under her fingernails, suggesting she had handled a special type of glove typically used by antique dealers. At that moment, the officer found a missing person report for someone named Lyle, who worked at a museum. It seemed like a promising lead. Henry and Jo went to the museum, where the curator led them to Lyle's workspace. Following the clues, Henry found the box the girl had been going through when she was injured. The weapon was long gone, but the fabric that had wrapped it still bore an imprint. Henry recognized it as an ancient Roman dagger, causing him to think of Adam, who had once told him that the first time he died, it had been because of an ancient Roman dagger. Adam believed the dagger might be capable of killing him, and without a doubt, he was behind all of this. Little did he know, Adam was also at the museum, silently watching his every move. Through further investigation, Jo learned that the victim had recently met with a relics expert who had even published an article about ancient Roman daggers. Henry and Joe found him, and he confirmed that the girl had brought a dagger to him for authentication. The expert determined that the dagger was from 44 BC, the same dagger that had been used to assassinate Julius Caesar. He believed the dagger was cursed, bringing death wherever it went. Joe, of course, didn't believe in such superstitions. The expert explained that Lyle had left after their meeting to have dinner with her fiancé. When Henry and Joe found Lyle's fiancé, they accused him of killing Lyle. Terrified, the man almost wet himself before confessing everything. He and Lyle had been preparing for their wedding but had no money. He took photos of the dagger and put them online, hoping to sell it for a high price. However, Lyle didn't agree, believing the dagger belonged to the museum. Lyle's fiancé told his friend about the situation, not expecting his friend to be so eager to help. The friend followed Lyle, pretending to be a robber, and stole the dagger. Despite this, Lyle's fiancé didn't think his friend would have killed Lyle. When they found the friend at his place, they were shocked to see him covered in wounds, having been tortured nearly beyond recognition. Henry noticed that the friend's blood had yet to coagulate, and his body was still warm, meaning the killer wasn't far. Joe immediately started searching the building. Suddenly, the man began convulsing. He was still alive. Just as Henry tried to save him, Adam appeared behind him. It turned out that Adam hadn't found the dagger yet and had tortured the man, only to discover that the dagger wasn't with him either. Adam warned Henry not to get any ideas about taking the dagger, then moved toward the room, having heard Joe's voice. Joe had searched the building thoroughly and found no suspicious figures, but she noticed that Henry's gaze was fixed on the room. Instinctively, she grew cautious, drew her gun, and headed toward the door. Henry pleaded with her not to go in, knowing just how dangerous Adam could be. Just as Joe was about to enter, Henry quickly stepped in front of her, blocking the entrance. Inside the room, Adam slashed his own throat with the dagger, then vanished in the blink of an eye, leaving the dagger to fall to the floor. Henry swiftly stepped on it to hide it. Furious, Joe scolded Henry for messing up her plan. Henry made an excuse, saying he was startled by the dagger to cover up his actions. Back at the police station, Henry deliberately misled the investigation, claiming the dagger had thrown them off track and that there was no real connection between the two murders. Clearly, he didn't want Joe to find the dagger. Just then, Lucas arrived, revealing that he had found a common link between the two bodies. It was a blow to Henry's plan, swift and painful. Besides the stab wounds, Lucas noted that both victims had significant bruising, likely from being struck with some kind of object. They also found traces of plastic dust on the victim's arms, similar to the special gloves used at the museum. They returned to the museum, where Joe questioned the front desk staff while Henry glanced at the security guard in the lobby. In an instant, he realized that the guard wore the same gloves, and the bruises on the victims likely came from his baton. Henry followed the guard into a dimly lit room, but the guard surprised him by appearing from behind. Henry took several hits, and the guard showed no signs of holding back. Luckily, Joe arrived just in time to gain control of the situation. The guard was then taken away for questioning. Joe's patience with Henry had run out, suspecting he was hiding something. Henry suggested a different interrogation approach, which worked. The suspect relaxed and even started chatting about personal matters. After drinking a cup of coffee, the guard suddenly showed signs of distress and collapsed to the ground. Henry rushed into the interrogation room, urging Joe to call for medical assistance. As soon as Joe left, Henry secretly asked the guard about the whereabouts of the ancient dagger. Shortly after, the medics arrived and concluded that the guard's discomfort was caused by something he ingested. Joe looked at the coffee on the table and realized what had happened. Meanwhile, Henry found the relic's expert. Ever since the expert saw the ancient dagger that day, he had wanted to keep it for himself. But Lyle insisted it belonged to the museum, so the expert bribed the security guard to help him. It turns out the expert had discovered a wartime notebook from World War II, detailing inhumane experiments and the torture of Adam, suggesting that Adam's immortality was linked to that ancient Roman dagger. The expert believed the story without question. He pulled out the dagger, eager to put the theory to the test. At that moment, they heard a noise at the door. Suspecting that it's Adam, Henry quickly grabbed the dagger and hid behind the door, ready to strike. To his surprise, it was Joe. She demanded that Henry hand over the dagger, but he hesitated, wanting to protect her, but unsure of how to explain his actions. Back in the forensics office, Henry asked Lucas to retrieve the dagger from the evidence room, but Lucas refused. Joe had already told him if Henry got his hands on the dagger, he'd be fired. Henry tried to talk his way out of it, but Lucas directed him to some files on his desk. To Henry's surprise, the dagger was already there. Lucas had secretly retrieved it for him. Henry then headed to the subway station, unaware that Joe was tailing him. But in the crowded station, Joe eventually lost sight of him. Henry arrived in the basement, only to find that Adam had been waiting for him. It turned out they had arranged this meeting over the phone. Adam remarked that he had once shared Henry's hope for the world, but life hadn't been kind to him. He knew Henry had come to kill him. As Henry pulled out the dagger, he simply tossed it in front of Adam, hoping to make it clear that he wanted Adam to leave him alone. But Adam brought up the suffering Henry's wife endured before her death and even pulled out their photos. When Henry remained unfazed, Adam drew his gun. Adam's only goal was to test if a gun would kill Henry and if the dagger would end his own life. Lacking the courage to test it on himself, he decided to use Henry as the unlucky subject. He fired a shot at Henry. Two outcomes were possible. Joe would find Henry's body, or she would witness his disappearance. Either way, it spelled trouble for Henry. Adam relished the scene before him, but when he noticed Henry seemed to want to say something, he squatted down in front of him. Unexpectedly, Henry produced a syringe and jabbed it into Adam's neck. Adam writhed in agony, unaware of what Henry had injected him with. Trembling, he staggered away, while Henry lay helplessly convulsing on the ground. At that moment, Joe finally followed the gunshots to the basement. She didn't find Henry, but did spot his pocket watch. Just then, Henry miraculously revived in the river, proving that a gun couldn't kill him after all, which relieved Abe, who had been waiting there all along. Meanwhile, Adam had managed to pull himself up, but collapsed on the ground after just a few steps, unconscious. At the hospital, Adam was left in a vegetative state. Although his body was paralyzed, his mind was still active, and he could clearly hear Henry and the doctor's conversation. Later, Henry returned to the antique shop, and life finally seemed to return to normal. However, Joe soon came looking for him, holding Henry's pocket watch. Henry had no choice but to claim that the watch had been stolen. Unexpectedly, Joe pulled out an old photograph, a family portrait of Henry's from over 60 years ago. She demanded an explanation, and with encouragement from Abe, Henry finally decided to reveal all of his secrets to Joe. This is Daniel CC Movie Channel. Stay safe and enjoy your day.